Thank you for tuning in on this China Cafe podcast. My name is Monique Knapen. I am the chair of the Association Netherlands-China. I hope you will enjoy our VNC China Cafe podcast. If you're interested in our other VNC activities, please visit our website of the VNC, vnc-china.nl. And if you want to receive our updates regularly, our newsletters and our magazine, then you can also consider become a member. Then you will always be updated. Thank you.
Now we're gonna have a China Cafe, which is we have 4 times a year. And this time the session will be on branding. Branding across borders, lessons learned from the West and East. That's the title of this session, because we want to look at branding, so brand building, both from a Western perspective and a Chinese perspective. Where are the differences? What can you learn from each other? So that's the intake of this China Cafe. We'll be talking about brand trust and about innovation cycles and cultural sensitivities, cultural emotions, and all kinds of tactics that differ both here in the Netherlands or in Europe even, or the West even, and China. I will ask a lot of questions to Aldo Spaanjaars. He's a board member also of VNC, but more to say he's a seasoned executive. He has been working in China over 25 years. Has been back now for 2-3 years.
2.5, yeah.
2.5. So he worked for the JWT, that's an advertisement company, for a very long time. He was had a leadership role at Adidas, all in China, for Lacoste also, and for Chinese brand Anta Sport. He was also having a marketing leading role there. He's the co-author of this book, which really is really recommendable, Dragon Tactics. And he's writing now a second volume of this. This one is about what can we learn from Chinese strategies and tactics. And it's really valuable to read and also to follow Aldo for his second volume, which will be called
Globalizing
Dragon Tactics. And there he will especially look at what the Chinese need to do to be successful here in the European market.
And what Westerners can do to help them.
And how to cooperate with these companies here, the Chinese companies here. He has also been awarded the Asia Pacific Marketeer of the Year prize, announced by Media Magazine, which is an established magazine in the field of media and branding. So I think we really have to deal with an experienced speaker here who can answer any questions I have and you have. Let's start. I would think you're ready. Yeah, we prepared this, of course. I have his approval to break in or make remarks on his answers. But for you, please keep your questions till the end. We will have a Q&A later on, so that we have an ongoing interview also for the podcast reason, but it is the rule of the game. Okay, question 1. You have been working at all these companies in China, including Adidas, Lacoste, and also for Chinese company Anta Sports. This journey, how did you approach to branding evolve over the years? Having this experience in all these companies, have you transitioned your mindset about branding?
Yes, very much. I first went to China in 1992. That was my first, straight after I graduated. I have, among others, a degree in politics and a degree in economics, with marketing being the focus. So I went to Asia with the idea of working in an advertising agency. I ended up doing that. I'm one of the co-founders of J. Walter Thompson in Beijing in the mid-90s. And when I went there, I had a very Western idea of brand building. You need to invest long-term. My last job was with Anta, a Chinese sportswear company, and it was the exact opposite world. So what I'm going to talk a lot about is the difference between a Western brand building approach, which is very much longer term, building trust, being consistent, versus a Chinese approach, which is very much short term, very much focused on quick wins, on endorsements, etc. And my journey literally has gone from being this first, I want to build everything long term, to being at Anta, where I was for the first time the only person who was more or less believing in a longer term approach. Whereas my entire team and the entire leadership, everybody wanted to do quick, and KOL here, KOL there. So I have literally over time, in advertising, it was still very new in China, so we really tried to do the Western way to help brands build for the long term. Then when I went to Adidas, things started already becoming a bit more digital. This is still pre the WeChats, because WeChat didn't come until 2012 roughly. So we started digitizing, so there was already a little bit more of a faster turn. But when I arrived at Lacoste as the CEO, that's when the first time we had a digital platform that we could use, and then we really started to try to do more with viral films and much more KOL endorsements. And that's when for the first time, I found myself at odds with headquarters, because at Lacoste, because they were still very much thinking the more traditional way. And that's when I then went to Anta, where everybody was, new trend, we are sports. New trend of frisbeeing. We need to do something with frisbeeing. Well, we're a winter sports brand. We're selling skis and we're selling winter jackets. Why are we doing something with frisbeeing? Yes, it's a new trend. So it was really these type of discussions. And how do you ultimately balance that? That is a journey I went through basically over the years.
And did you adopt more to the Chinese short-term focus, or could you convince your co-workers to also adapt a little bit of this long-term focus for Western branding?
I think it was difficult to convince people within Anta that I was correct. I was actually brought in to help them build.
You say I was correct.
Yes, because I still feel that if you want to build a brand, if you look at the Chinese environment, there's a lot of hyper competition. So a lot of brands are focusing on getting the attention of people. For that, you need to think short term. You have lots of KOLs. They can help you get
KOL. Who knows what is a KOL?
Key opinion leader.
Yeah, she's from the field, I know.
So you have a lot of
key opinion
leaders
leader
that can help you gain that attention. So the problem is, ultimately, consumers, especially in a world that potentially slows down, or when these companies go abroad, a lot more consumers would like to have a trusted brand. So if there's always something new, it's very difficult to build up a relationship. And I think if you, one of China's leading sportswear companies, you have to do more to build a longer term brand base and a brand DNA. What is Anta? If you ask the average consumer today, they will probably say it's a sport brand, but they cannot say much more. I was heavily involved in two other brands. One is called Descente and the other one is Cologne. One is Korean, the other one is Japanese. And these brands had no history whatsoever in China. So if you're then consistently trying to do something new, you're not explaining that the brand actually has heritage, which is critical for a sports brand.
And how did you convince them?
Having lots of debates, not always winning them, bringing in agencies, helping them to explain what it is to build a longer term brand, and at the same time also myself adapting, because the world is becoming more digital. Even if you look here in the West, the brands are becoming more short term. So the traditional long term brand building is also in the Western world no longer the way forward. Ultimately, it will be a hybrid where you need to invest in DNA. You need to determine what that brand DNA is, and then you need a lot of activities to keep brands at people's
top of mind.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think for Chinese culture, they do have a long-term view, which is not so detailed as yet, but there's a very bright spot on the horizon for every project that they're doing, and they're also very short-term in their actions and in their tactics. So this balance between long-term trust and how you call this, short-term successes. Is that not very applicable and very much related to the Chinese culture in that way?
Not when it comes to brand building. At least that is my experience. Chinese companies have long-term visions, but these are North Stars. At Anta, for example, it is to become number one globally, full stop. That's their vision. I worked for Fosun for a while, and they had a North Star where they wanted to bring health, wealth, and happiness to 1 billion people. So these are very long-term visions. And actually in the book, in Dragon Tactics, we write a lot about that. So there's a long-term vision, but within the vision, you're completely fluid. You can go left tomorrow, right the day after, left again the day after. At Fosun, I could change my personal objectives every quarter. If I wanted to do something completely different, I was allowed to, if I could argue why it was. So if that is your approach to brand building, you cannot invest enough in DNA. So yes, there is long-term vision, but it is not the type of vision that you need as a brand.
Good. I was wondering that. Well, you're talking about brand is trust in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in China, you need speed and trend adaptation. And how do you see this work out in practice?
I think in China, it's also trust, but it's a different form of trust. And I always talk about, when I talk about China and the West, I talk about a low trust culture and a high trust culture. And high and low, in this case, is not about good or bad. It is a different form of trust, where a high trust culture is based on the rule of law, on contracts. When somebody says something, you can trust it happens. In a low trust culture, you tend not to rely on these type of documents. You trust people that are very close by, because you cannot trust many people. You trust the people that are part of your family or that are your classmates you went to university with. And surprisingly, it's celebrities. Well, if this celebrity buys this product, then it has to be good, because he cannot risk his reputation for a bad product. And this is what has happened in one of the real things that has surprised me was the use of those celebrities. I always thought when I started in advertising, we don't need that, it's a fad. But it just kept coming back. And even today, the use of celebrities is so critical, because that is a proxy for building trust. So here in the West, we trust the brand because, a lot of them have history, they have tradition, they have proven themselves. In China, some brands are breaking through. So Anta is a trusted brand, but if Anta wants to sell their newest pair of shoes, they still would need a sport athlete or a KOL to help promote that, because the shoe itself, people want to know more about. So it's a different form of trust, but in both worlds, trust is critical to build a successful brand.
And you're talking about celebrities being the key factor in that, showing that it's a popular and well-accepted trend. But since it's a relationship culture, do you also think that there's some peer pressure or family pressure, or your near guanxi, if they say something is good, you need to follow, or is that less important?
I'm sure there's also some pressure, but I think it's also a source of information. It's again, if your family members like it, then there's a higher chance you're going to like it too, because there is trust. Obviously, also with brands, if your mates wear it, you want to have it as well. So of course, that type of rivalry, keeping up with the Joneses, that is also in China. But I think definitely word of mouth plays a very important role in China still today, because of the fact that it is a low trust environment.
And also foreign brands in China, they need to build this trust, this long-term trust. And then I think it would help that there's no alternative maybe, or better, not a good alternative like Dutch milk powder, for instance, when we have these crisis long time back already, but that helps, of course, to build that trust. Or German cars.
Yes, correct.
But that's changing.
The German cars are changing rapidly, yes. The Dutch milk powder, I'm not so sure. I think that's still very much trusted.
Also changing.
It would probably, yes, because It depends. If there would be another food scare, they probably gain preference again. But German cars, that is definitely a very difficult position to be in today.
Yeah.
It's I first left China in 2019, and at the time the license plates in China you have two license plates: green for EVs and blue for combustible engines. And a bit anecdotal, when I left for the first time in 2019, it was about 80% were blue plates, 20% green plates. When I came back in 2021, after I'd done a project for Fosun in Germany, it was the other way around. And the only 20% of blue cars that still were driving were a Mercedes, a BMW, and a Lexus. Everything else had gone. So today there are no very good alternatives yet for these top brands, but with a Li Auto, a NIO, if they survive, they will start rivaling some of those European brands. And I think midterm, long term, maybe if you sell Ferraris, you can probably still be successful over time. But I'm not sure whether Mercedes is still as successful 10 years from today as they were 10 years ago.
Yes, and I think also at this moment Chinese consumers are also more in favor maybe for Chinese brands.
Yes.
So for Western brands it's a tough job maybe to build that trust in China.
Because historically Western brands had a quality preference. When I worked at Adidas, I started there in 2004. Local brands at the time were simply not as good. Today, if you look at Anta product, it rivals what Adidas puts out. So the quality of the product, if you want a good pair of running shoes, you don't have to buy Adidas or Nike because you can get that same quality from Anta. That was not the case. So, and a lot of Western brands, although some of them have adjusted and improved, a lot of Western brands are still not completely connecting with the way Chinese brands are connecting. So if the quality is less and less of an issue, if people trust local brands better also for quality, and they serve other values, both intrinsic and extrinsic, better or as good as foreign brands, why would you want a foreign brand?
Yeah, and in the past it added to your status and to your face.
Correct.
Having a foreign brand, which is totally the opposite at the moment. I think.
Yeah.
This short-term focus, do you think it also has to do, and this fast iteration, this fast adaptation of new trends, do you think it also has to do with the hyper-competitiveness in the market and also the less matureness maybe of some products?
So in a lot of my discussions when I talk about China, China is probably the most competitive market on the planet. The way I've always described it in the past, you would go to Europe, you have some European brands, or mostly European brands, maybe a few Americans, maybe a few Asians, but not many. You go to the US, same story. You go to China, they're all there, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Europeans. So the level of competition is extremely high. Plus, Chinese companies, they all have this really intense competitive need and drive. So they throw a lot of money at it, they try to run as quickly as possible. And this is why, although consumers are already looking for the new trend, it's also in the interest for a new brand to consistently refresh themselves to stay top of mind in order to stay ahead of the competition. So it's basically two forces that amplify each other. Consumers are used to getting something new. One of the biggest discussions I've always had with headquarters was we didn't have enough innovation in the market. And then people would laugh at me and say, how come? This is China. I sell them anything. I said, no, we need more colors at Adidas. We need faster innovation. In my book, we spent an entire chapter about the role of innovation in a Chinese context versus a Western context. In China, innovation is much more short-term. It's a little bit. At Anta, we were consistently changing product. A little zipper here. So consistently trying to have freshness. And that is one of the things that Western brands completely underestimate when they go to China. And this is why they're struggling also with the brand. Because if you are not being seen as a brand that invests, if you have a store outfit that doesn't change for 3 to 4 years, but your Chinese competitors change it every 2 years, you look outdated very quickly. So these are important elements in order to build a brand also in China today.
Yeah. in order to keep your consumers and your clients. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think, which approach leads to more long-term brand success? This Western trust building or this constantly speed and trend adoption?
In China or in the West, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Make it more complex.
Let's start with China. I believe that more and more larger brands, like the Antas, obviously Haier is already doing this, Xiaomi, they are investing more in their core brand DNA. They understand that over time they have to build a more stable brand. That doesn't mean that the market will become long-term. It will remain a short-term market. But at the same time, what you see in China, the economy is slowing. So the economy is changing. So the last sort of land grab few decennia that we've had is likely going to change. I'm not saying it will completely change, but there will be more brands that will become really leading, and they'll have to defend their territory, and for that they need longer term vision, but they also need to keep themselves fresh and new. Western brands going there will become more like Chinese brands in faster iteration and higher levels of innovation. Otherwise, they will not survive. For Chinese brands coming to the West, the big learning is how can they build trust? There are brands that are not known. How many cars do we know? BYD, Xpeng. I think if we go onto the street today, right now, and we ask people about Xpeng and BYD, they probably cannot define them well. So Chinese brands will have to invest in that. So they will have to come up with longer term strategies. If they're consistently trying to do something new, Western consumers cannot build a picture of those brands, and they will therefore not trust them. So they will have to figure out what does it take to build this trust over time and invest in that consistently. Because if anything, in the West, brands have to be built in a consistent way. That doesn't mean you cannot also use short-term campaigns, but there has to be a mid-term to a long-term strategy in order to build that. So Chinese brands will definitely have to adjust, and some of them do that very well. Haier being a very good example.
I think that's very difficult, that if you are in this quickly changing market and you need to launch innovations all the time, it's quite challenging to be true to yourself and to be self-aware and have this strong DNA. Can you elaborate on that?
That goes down to the discussions I had at Anta. You have to define yourself. You need to agree that doing frisbee when you sell a winter sports brand is not relevant. So the way to do it is really define what does the brand stand for, and then make sure whatever you do, even if that is short term, it still stays within that longer term brand DNA. If you repeat things very quickly, but they're all related to each other, consumers can recognize that. If your products are speaking that same language, if your packaging speaks that same language, then you can build a longer-term brand along your DNA lines while being consistently innovating and updating yourself. So I think it's very much possible, but it starts with understanding where do you want to be in 5 years from today. And not thinking, okay, let's see what tomorrow brings.
Yeah, and not be all over the place, but be consistent in a few factors.
Yeah.
Can you share a moment where cultural misunderstanding was significantly important in a branding initiative? Cultural misunderstanding.
There are many of them, but one that really springs to mind, and I'm sure people here have probably heard about it, is Dolce & Gabbana with their chopstick ads. Can anyone remember these?
That was pizza.
Pizza eating and spaghetti eating with chopsticks. It's when you look at those ads, they're actually not. Had you used them in the West, probably said they would be funny. But it is, if you really look at it from a Chinese point of view, it is quite derogative. So that was an absolute brouhaha, and basically, I think Dolce & Gabbana never recovered from it completely. Some other brands, Mercedes has had problems with cultural sensitivities. Gucci has had these problems. And the things are being blown up very, very quickly on the internet these days. So I think there are lots of cases. I'm sure at my days at Adidas, we have had a few cases where we were not always culturally sensitive. But it also goes this way. Has anyone heard of byd.de? Francis. Okay. byd.de, that's a German website, and you would think they sell cars. They don't. They actually sell adult toys. So when they were investing all this money during the Euros, of course, people in Germany would go online and find out a bit more about BYD. And as you do in Germany, you don't type .com, you type .de. And then you actually came on a website that says, hello, we are... this is a temporary website of byd.de. The real website is coming soon, and then spelled with the U instead of the O. And this is a true story. So it blew me away. Like, can it really be that
it's
BYD
so naive.
didn't know about this? So either they had no idea because they don't focus on websites, because in China you don't use websites. So had they not realized that if you have a .com, you also need to have a .de? Were they aware about it? They tried to buy it, but they couldn't, and they just had to risk it. I don't know, but I just find that a really interesting story.
You didn't find out whether...
No, I have not been able to find out yet. Although I'm trying, because I want to write about it in my book. So I'm trying to figure out the story behind it.
Okay, tell us later.
Exactly. So, and obviously, there are other examples as well where. Again, if you try to be too short-term, or if you try to be, there's an ad from Shein that they use in Brazil. If you were to run that here in Europe, it would never work. I do hope that Chinese marketeers are understanding more and more that also on this side, culture really plays an important role.
So it's all about localization, and also
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely
being able to. Yeah, really stand in the shoes of your customer, also culture-wise. Can you tell us something about how the Chinese consumers emotionally connect to brands compared to Western consumers? What are some strategies that work, and what have you seen that would surprise Western marketeers?
I think it's a different type of emotion. As I said, I think emotionally, it's very. It's in the West. I think it's more trust related. The emotion. I think you can definitely use longer term stories, but in China it's more difficult to really do storytelling because people they want to see more what the product's all about. Whereas here. I can show you ads from Apple or from Amazon, or if you go to the John Lewis ads in the UK, they have become complete stories that are highly emotional to the core. Some of that can work in China as well, but a lot of it is still show me the money and I'll go with that. So that type of emotional storytelling, I think, is still very difficult to do in China.
Yeah, it should not be as conceptual maybe as we are here in the West, and should be more concrete and more to the point.
It has to be pragmatic.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean you cannot use emotion, but it's a different form of emotion.
And you use your celebrities to show that emotion.
Correct.
Yeah. And micro deals, I've seen it when I'm on the Chinese internet. You get vouchers for everything, and you get advantages all the time. The pop-ups show in your face. It's also something.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier. It's very transactional. So the emotion is, do I get a good deal? So obviously, if you look at the strength of a Luckin coffee versus a Starbucks, if you see what Temu does. There are these consistent, with Luckin Coffee, you never know what you're going to pay. You go there, but there is in your app always something happening. Okay, now I get a further discount. If you look at Pinduoduo, the level of discounts you're getting consistently. I don't know whether any of you has signed up to Temu, but the number of SMSs you get, or the messages that show up in the app. That is a complete Chinese invention, which blows me away. And I think that is definitely a capability Western brands will have to start building, because as we get in a more digital, AI-driven world, these things are going to matter. And this is where the Chinese marketeers have a very strong advantage, because they're very good at that.
Yeah, and it's a closed ecosystem as well. I remember I was at Luckin Cafe in Shanghai, I think, and I didn't have any signal, so I could not retrieve my vouchers, and so I could not pay. Said the man at the counter, say you need to pay with your Alipay, otherwise. But I have renminbi here.
Yeah.
No. My system does not accept RMB anymore.
No, completely digital.
So that's completely digital. Yeah. That's something we really need to adapt to in the West, I think.
So it becomes more transactional.
But we will be talking about the digital ecosystem some more. You have platforms like WeChat and Xiaohongshu and Douyin. They're driving the commerce. That's the only way. That's the only motor behind it, I could say. Do you see us adapting that? That's maybe a little bit like your question just now.
Will we become more like China, you mean? Or?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the first things to understand about the Chinese ecosystem is that a lot of these platforms have a different role to play. Xiaohongshu is more about exploration, about peer reviewing, about sharing information. Bilibili has again another function, is much more Gen Z. WeChat is much more integrated in the business world. So if you want to build a loyalty program, that's when you use WeChat. So these different functions at this stage are a bit more difficult to replicate in the West, because, for example, with WhatsApp, you would expect a bit more like WeChat, but there is no, there is a WhatsApp for business, but it's not yet linked to loyalty programs, for example. So I think it will be difficult in the current ecosystems to replace or replicate what Chinese brands have at home. And I think this is why a lot of Chinese brands coming this way are struggling. But as companies like Shein and Temu show, it can be done. Shein became extremely successful by simply scraping all the social media platforms in the West and learning in terms of trends. So it can be done. It may not be done at the same level as it is done in China, but I hear Elon Musk always talking about that he wants to copy WeChat with his X platform, and I'm sure other people are working on these type of integrations. The Dutch pay app Ideal is going in Europe, so the next step is it may be built into a social media platform. So I think we will move in that direction, but obviously we are miles behind what we have in China today.
So when Chinese companies arrive here and they want to build a brand here, they really have to take a step back in that digitalization. They need to build a website again, and they need to be present at our less sophisticated platforms, maybe.
They definitely have to invest in websites. That is for any brand important here. Yet at the same time, you can do a lot with social media. But everybody still, with my own company, we had a call last week with a potential partner, and in the call he said, "Oh, I had a look at your website." So it's had we not had a website, then that is how people learn in the West about other companies. So as a Chinese company, you need to have that, but you can still achieve a lot with the different social media. But the more you can control, the better. That's currently the way to go.
Yeah, and don't be a BYD and think you don't need BYD.de.
If somebody has a very good contact for me at BYD, then I'd love to get
Which one?
Linked up.
The DE one?
Exactly. Yes, ideally the DA one.
You just mentioned Haier as a big example that was successful in building a global brand while also having these short-term successes. And also Shein, I believe, is also a good example. What can Western companies learn from this, you think?
I think from Haier, what people can learn is their level of innovation. That is where Western companies, if you see how Haier has become a global player, that is all built on being extremely narrowly customer focused. They've created a whole range of products for very specific niche markets. I'm sure people have heard of the little fridge for college dorms in the US, where they really started with. But people may have never heard that they built complete different washing machines in India, because saris have a lot more fabric. And I can go on and on and on. So that level of innovation is something...
Innovation localized again.
Exactly. Customer focus. I mean, being customer focused is one of the... And I think this is a real big difference between... In the West, we talk about being customer focused. We do the occasional research, and now we say we are customer focused, or we do a big research at the beginning of a project. In China, a lot of Chinese companies are truly customer focused. If you work at Xiaomi, you have to, on a daily basis, answer, no matter what job you have to answer consumer calls. Here we have a call center that we put at a business park somewhere, and never the headquarters and the consumer-facing people talk to each other. Literally, including the CEO, Lei Jun at Xiaomi, they have to take consumer calls and they have to solve problems. Now, that is truly consumer
Then you're
focused.
engaged, yeah.
Completely. And I can give you a lot more of those examples. So being truly consumer focused, Haier is one of those truly consumer focused companies. And that is what Western companies can learn.
But they also do this short-term successes.
Haier actually, and this is where I think Haier is a case for Chinese companies to actually study. Haier has done an incredibly good job to build a longer-term, very consistent brand globally.
Western style. Actually.
Western style. It's a lot of their ads are very strong. They are localized. They are emotional. They build brand stories. So I think they have done a very good job. I'd hoped tonight to bring somebody from Haier, but sadly they don't have an office here in the Netherlands. I tried to get somebody from the UK to dial in, but we could not get that going, because I really think that they're a very interesting brand for Chinese companies to learn about.
But are they then still successful in China as well with this strategy?
Yes. Haier has a very strong brand both in China and outside China.
As a proof that this long-term focus works as well.
Absolutely. And again, but also if you look at Lenovo, for example, they ended up buying a brand that helped them grow internationally. Haier has done this completely under their own steam with their own brand name. So a lot of respect for that company. And then where else can we learn? You mentioned Shein.
Shein, yeah.
Well, in the case of Shein, the brand is the supply chain. They do two things extremely well. One, that is trend forecasting, but without that supply chain, their trend forecasting would not be worth much, because if you cannot launch 1,000 new products every day, then your trend forecasting may be great, but it doesn't get you anywhere. So what they have built in terms of supply chain is incredible. And I know for a fact that Alibaba is trying to replicate that supply chain in China, actually, because you can't build that supply chain anywhere else. Although Shein is now actually trying to rebuild that in Brazil to serve at least that part of the market if it is more difficult to import from China. But the supply chain, of course, is the brand, and a lot of respect for that.
Yeah, but it's an example, Shein, you cannot easily copy that. Not even Alibaba, maybe.
Even Amazon is struggling to rebuild or to build, and they should have all the resources they need to do it, but they find it difficult to build that.
That's quite a unique example, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
Could you share a case where a Western brand successfully pivoted in China, so make a turn in China?
I don't think there is a aha moment for any brand. I don't think that there is a real pivot. It's always a learning over time. If I have to come up with a pivot, then I would probably say Starbucks after 2012, 2013. Historically, Starbucks, and this says how many companies get China completely wrong. The management team at Starbucks China for years reported into Seattle. So the head of marketing reported to the head of marketing in Seattle. The head of HR reported to the head of HR. So how can you run a business in a market so complex and so large as China with your boss sitting in a different time zone who has absolutely no idea about your local decisions? And even if you ask for advice, they have no idea what to say because they don't know the market. So then Howard Schultz became smart, and he hired Belinda Wong, ex McDonald's lady, and he said, Belinda, you're in charge. And then literally, I think for 10 years, Starbucks had about 300, 400 stores, and they went like this. And then after Belinda came on, they went like this, and now they have 7,000, 8,000, maybe even more, 12,000 locations. So if there's anything that is pivoted, because what they did, they completely localized the business. A lot of the beverages were okay, but they completely revamped the food, much more localized. And they went heavily digital. So Starbucks in China for years was the breeding ground for Starbucks globally when it came to their digital development. And it even saved Starbucks during COVID, because all their stores were closed, but they had built digital infrastructure in China that they could copy to other parts of the world, so they could actually build a delivery business.
Yeah, you must be real brave then, because in that time I think there were no examples like that.
No, and that shows how visionary Howard Schultz is, the founder, because he came back. He came back to Starbucks, and when he came back, he said, "Belinda, you do it."
And you saw other Western companies follow this example?
If they haven't, they're not longer in China.
It's the only way to survive, local for local.
It's the only way, local for local. Even car companies are now going local for local. It has to be local for local. Otherwise, forget it.
Yeah. And what are the biggest missteps Western companies still make, maybe even when entering China?
I would say cultural insensitivity. It's not understanding. Going there with the idea that the way things work in the West, I'm going to replicate here. It works everywhere. Why would it not work in China? I think a lot of those failure cases are all in the past. I don't think that there are still companies going to China with that attitude, because I think by now it is very well known that it is such a complex market that is so different, and if you don't do it properly, don't waste your money. But I think if you look at the periods in particular between straight after the financial crisis and sort of until 2018, 2019, there's this entire graveyard of Western businesses that have all failed, because after the financial crisis, every CEO thought, my business in the West is dead, let's go to China, growth market. So they all went there, guns blazing, brought lots of resources, but they all did it the Western way, and a lot of these companies have failed over time. So I don't think there's one particular case. I think a lot of companies simply didn't understand China well. And it started with, and it sounds, I would always say when I walk into a room and Western people start talking, I ask them to be quiet, and I ask the Chinese people to speak first, because that is the only way in a China context to understand what is going on. And I think if you don't bring that attitude, if you don't bring how are things being done here, it's not going to work, because it is a very different market.
But it's still a learn by doing kind of market.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a market. Let's try things. It's a place where you can innovate, where people. I always talk about 80-20. In the West, we try to make things perfect before we put them out in the market.
Yeah, the
80-20
rule.
Put them out at 80%. It may not be perfect, but two things happen. One, you're first. And secondly, you can learn how to improve things. And now your next iteration is better. So it's this consistent innovation, trying, testing, that is perfect in China.
Good. As a last question, because we're talking 50 minutes already.
Okay.
What advice would you give to young marketeers and entrepreneurs who want to operate successfully between China and the West?
I think I gave the answer already a little bit.
Just now.
It's, ask the right questions. Understand what is going on. One of the things that I really learned in China is the ability to observe. In the West, we like to talk. In China, they observe. And that is one of the strengths that I had to build over time. Let's first figure out what is happening. And because if you figure out what's happening, you can make decisions that are much more related. There's even a difference in the definition of genius between the West and China on this topic. It's you're a genius in the West if you come up with a brilliant idea. You're a genius in China if you come up with a solution that you could learn about in the here and now. And I think that goes for whether you're Chinese working in China or whether you're Chinese working in the West or a Westerner working here or there. Understand your audience. You can only be a good marketeer, you can only build a brand if you know why people want to buy something that you have to sell and how you can sell it to them. And that is, every young marketeer needs to learn that.
And then have locals in your team as well, otherwise you
have
cannot...
a mixed team. In my second book, we're actually talking about what Chinese companies need to do to build success here. Don't just bring Chinese, no, build an international team. Have more than one nationality. At Adidas in China, I think we had 1,200 people, and I think we had 30 or 40 nationalities. From Asia, from the West, very different cultural mix, because that is how you can debate and ultimately come up with solutions.
Yeah, that's synergy, I think, putting cultures together. That's also the aim of our association. So it's a nice close-up, I think. We still have some time for questions. Frans.
Although very interesting story, very interesting discussion. Philips uses a different name in China. It's the only country in the world where they don't use the name Philips with a Chinese name. Chinese companies coming to the West don't do that. As far as I know, maybe there are. And you see Western people like the Dutch struggling with Chinese names. Take Huawei. All kind of. What would your recommendation to Chinese companies be? Just accept this, or come up with a somewhat different name to be more, which sounds easier to remember for Western.
I think in the 1980s, Toyota did advertising where they actually taught people how to pronounce Toyota. Toyota. So I think there are funny ways of doing that. I think Huawei probably should have done more, because everyone calls it Huawei, and that just sounds silly. So if I had been Huawei, I would have invested in my brand, and one way would have been how to explain how to pronounce it. A lot of Chinese brands have already, beyond their Chinese names, developed like Anta. You have two characters, but also you use Anta in the Western spelling. So you can bring that here, and you can keep pronouncing it the Chinese way, or you can pronounce it the Western way. So as a brand, I think you need both if you want to be a global brand. I see still some brands coming here with only Chinese characters. That's not going to last very long.
That's next level. Tom.
So from a branding perspective, do you not think it's more interesting for Chinese companies to acquire trust instead of building it? Because right now what you see is a lot of acquisitions happening in consumer brands. I think an interesting one is Arc'teryx, where all chairmen in China and at leisure now wear Arc'teryx, which used to be Western, but now has been adopted to be one of the most famous fashion brands in China. The pragmatic view on China is not just, wouldn't it just be easier to acquire a lot of companies? Because I think that's what's happening now in this current market.
I think the short answer is yes. I think it's more difficult for a Chinese brand. But then again, what can you buy? If you're in the car business and you're BYD, who can you buy? You're not going to...
Volvo.
Okay, Volvo, but that's the one that's after that, there's not much left. So you can buy Peugeot, but would Peugeot really help you if you're BYD?
But you're dominating the market, right? So
exactly, so they're dominant. But indeed, if you're in fashion, I think you can build a fashion brand, a Chinese fashion brand in the West. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done. Some of them are actually doing that. Jana Bui is a good example. They have a business that is, but they also bought a foreign brand as well. So they have the combination. That is Icicle. I think Icicle bought a second brand. So, long story short, it is easier, especially if you want to avoid all geopolitics, than simply buy something. But I still think, like Huawei, there is still a possibility to build your Chinese brand. It depends very much category to category, I think. I would not recommend BYD to change what they're doing. I think they're strong. They have to become a global brand. Actually, I've had many discussions. I know Gert-Jan at Huawei, so I've had lots of discussions with him. I said several times they need to start a second brand for their consumer business. Because I think it's more important there. They did have a brand called Honor for a while for their mobile phones, but they sold it out, and the brand in itself has actually developed quite a decent market. But Huawei does not believe in getting a second brand just for the consumer business. They still think that they can build a Huawei brand.
Sorry, ik weet je naam niet. Jack, hoi.
So you mentioned before that the Chinese market is hyper competitive, and that for Western companies to participate, they kind of have to go along with this short term, having many customer interactions, etc. But as a Western company, is there a way to enter the Chinese market without getting drawn too much into this hyper competitive market that might destroy your margins?
I don't think so. I think it's extremely difficult. You can try to build a digital presence where you don't have a lot of investment, but then you still need to get attention. So, and again, in China, attention is doing things differently constantly. Tom, you mentioned Arc'teryx. I worked for Anta. Anta is the owner actually of Arc'teryx because they own Amer Sports. We had several brands. One was called Descente, other one was Cologne or Anta. I've also worked for Lacoste. At Lacoste, when you look at the product pyramid, it's a triangle where you have 30-40% of basics. And then you have a mid-layer of season and you have a few fashion products. At Anta, our pyramid was upside down. We hardly had any basics. We had a very large layer of consistently refreshing products. And that was not always a complete new jacket. No, it was a little bit of new fabric here, a little zipper there, so that we constantly had something to talk about. From a product development point of view, it's relatively easy to do because an extra zipper, a different color zipper, that's easy to do from season to season. So I think that's the cost of doing business in China. And if you do not want to do that, my suggestion is not to spend the money trying to become competitive in China.
So then maybe a follow-up question. So if you have a very strong long-term European brand, what's the best way to utilize that in China?
If you have a strong long-term European brand, it is, I would say find a good partner. Going along these days, at China we had, at Adidas we had a Woofy, so we were our own, but I would not recommend that to most companies anymore. It depends a little bit category to category, but I think today, I was, in preparation for today's discussion, I was doing some research, and Heineken was in 2 or 3 provinces until 2018. They sold their rights to a Chinese brewing company. They're the only foreign company growing in China today. Why? They're riding the distribution of the Chinese company where they sold their rights to and where they now own 21%. So if you look at the success of Arc'teryx, the success of Descente in China is not because the Canadians are very clever. No, it is because Anta is operating that business and has completely differently positioned Arc'teryx. Arc'teryx in Canada is for mountaineers, it's hardcore. In China, it's the Gucci of outdoor. Complete different positioning. The stores are about 4, 5, 6, 7 times bigger than the shops in the West. They're big brand temples. So it's that type of knowledge. Arc'teryx would have never been able to do that themselves. And I would recommend anyone building a brand in China today, find a very good partner.
You mentioned Heineken, just coming back to France's question about naming. They're called Chili in China, right?
Which is something that has always surprised me. It's such a strange name.
Yeah, it's a star, but it's not Heineken.
I've always liked brand names that are Cola. That's perfect. At Adidas, we were Adidas, or Adi, as people called us. Adi. So as long as it is related close. Exactly. That would be always my recommendation.
It worked for Heineken in China anyway.
Yeah, it hasn't. I mean, they had basically, they were never as successful until they now go the more local way.
Yeah.
So in this case, the name probably would not have made a big difference. But because also Heineken is a different.
Nanting.
Yeah, exactly.
Last question for Chi.
Yeah.
I think if there.
Aldo, do you see that the Chinese companies are hiring more and more Western, let's say, marketing people now, or do you see still the same mistakes they make? Also, Western companies went to China.
Meaning when they come here or in China itself?
When they come here.
So some companies in China are hiring some Westerners, but what they do mostly is hiring Chinese people that have worked in the West. So because culturally they're closer. I spent 26 years of my life in China, and I found it difficult to have a real impact at ANTA because it is such a different culture. I speak Chinese. With AI, I could have my presentation that people were going to present while walking towards the conference room. I had it on my computer in Chinese, in English, while it was being presented in Chinese. And even I struggled. So I would not recommend too many Chinese brands to hire too many foreigners. Going here, it's actually quite interesting. I think too many Chinese companies are still relying too much on Chinese expats. Actually, that is a part of the book that we are writing. Yeah. In the first book, we quote Richard Liu, the founder of JD. He said, "Oh, of course, Amazon fails because they had all these foreigners that didn't understand China." Then, if you looked at what they did with Ochama, it was a bit of a repeat. So these are things that surprise me. So Richard Liu, very smart guy, he should understand that he made that comment 30 years ago. But why is he still doing the opposite when they come here? So I think Chinese companies will have to find a way to build a multinational team. I'm not saying they have to be necessarily Westerners. You can bring other people from Asia. Yeah. It has to be a multinational team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What surprised me actually was now these sport events. Nowadays they are all, let's say, Chinese brands having this advertisement. Nobody understands. Yeah? So I think they put a lot of money in it. And
there are only characters on the board.
But that is not for Western markets.
Yeah, is it for
Chinese
market or Western
that is aimed at back home. Yeah. They can be associated with big European sports events that gives them lots of mienza, and that is definitely so. Of course, BYD, they're trying to sell cars here. Hisense definitely has a business here.
Others are all in Chinese.
Yes,
for their home market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I thank you very much for your input and for listening so carefully. And I think we had a nice knowledge sharing again. Yes. Thank you very much for giving all these insights.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed this VNC China Cafe podcast. If you are interested in future VNC activities and would like to stay updated about future China cafes, please go to our website vnc-china.nl to become a member or just find out what's going on. Stay tuned for our next podcast.